catcalling. That single word was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's consistent reply for 8 full years every time Ben Shapiro invited her to sit face-to-face and answer questions without a sympathetic moderator, a rehearsed committee speech, or a social media crowd primed to cheer every practiced line. For those 8 years, she treated a public request for debate as if it were an unwelcome interruption, instead of a straightforward challenge to the ideas that had built her entire national brand. Tonight, however, there was no committee gavel to reclaim, no carefully edited Instagram clip to manage, and no easy path to convert a simple question into a viral lecture. Within the first 90 seconds, millions of viewers grasped why she had spent nearly a decade dodging this precise encounter. It was not because Ben Shapiro was cruel, intimidating, or uniquely aggressive, despite the framing she had repeated whenever the invitation resurfaced. It was because Shapiro asked questions that demand either yes or no, and those two words are hazardous to a politician whose whole communication strategy rests on substituting emotionally charged explanations for direct answers. A yes leads straight to the next question. A no leads just as quickly to the contradiction, and every answer shrinks the available escape routes until rhetoric is forced to confront the actual record. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had mastered television, social media, committee performances, fundraising messages, and moral declarations, yet she had never mastered the discipline of answering exactly what was asked. Tonight, after 8 years of fleeing that format, she finally stepped onto the stage and almost at once looked as if she wished she had stayed away for 8 more. The CNN set contained 2 chairs, 2 microphones, and the accumulated weight of 8 years of public avoidance hanging between them. Before either participant spoke, the event had been promoted as a broad discussion about the future of progressive politics, language carefully chosen to cast her appearance as a policy conversation rather than an admission that she had at last accepted Shapiro's challenge. Her team had prepared for 3 days, studying his rapid-fire sequences, his preference for binary questions, and the rhetorical traps he constructs by refusing to let an opponent change the subject. Their strategy was straightforward. Do not accept his framing. Do not answer in a single word. Expand every response into a paragraph. Control the clock and turn cross-examination into conversation. That strategy lasted roughly 4 minutes before it collapsed under the pressure of questions that insisted on facts rather than performance. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez opened precisely as expected, with the practiced energy, moral certainty, and polished cadence of someone who had spent years learning how to make every committee appearance resemble a campaign rally. She spoke of inequality, housing, working families, and the people in her district who deserved more from government, directing each line toward the camera rather than toward the man sitting across from her. The camera had always been her strongest ally, because the camera carries emotion farther than evidence, and emotion had repeatedly shielded her from the weaknesses in her legislative record. Then she addressed the invitation itself, reminding viewers that Shapiro had offered $10,000 for a debate in 2018 and that she had compared the request to catcalling. She stood by the comparison, arguing that when a man demands a woman's time and acts entitled to a response, the description still applies. The gallery applauded because the line was familiar, tested, and ready for social media before she finished delivering it. Ben Shapiro did not object to the personal framing, defend his intentions, or waste time arguing over whether the insult was fair, because doing so would have allowed her to seize control of the subject before the real debate had even begun. He simply stated that she was correct about one thing: he was not entitled to her time, but the roughly 720,000 constituents who funded her congressional salary were entitled to answers. He drew the distinction she had avoided for 8 years, saying that this was not catcalling, it was Congress. And Congress is supposed to be an institution where questions receive answers. Then he moved directly to the first question before she could convert his response into another speech. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had introduced the Green New Deal in 2019, so Ben Shapiro asked how much it would cost. Her answer followed the strategy her advisors had rehearsed, describing the Green New Deal as a framework for investment rather than a conventional budget item, and insisting that asking for a total cost was the wrong question. Shapiro ignored the attempted redefinition and asked the same question again, using the same words, because she had offered a paragraph when a number had been requested. He cited the American Action Forum estimate of $93 trillion over 10 years and noted that the resolution had no formal cost estimate, no defined funding mechanism, and no clear implementation timeline. In any serious profession, he argued, proposing a project with a potential $93 trillion impact without calculating its cost would be called malpractice. In Congress, it becomes a press conference and a fundraising opportunity. The point was not merely that the Green New Deal was expensive, because every major policy proposal has a price and every government program requires public money. The point was that she had promoted one of the most economically ambitious proposals in modern American politics without being able to state its estimated cost when asked directly on national television. She had spent years presenting herself as the intellectual and moral authority behind the proposal, yet the most elementary fiscal question produced not a figure, not a range, and not a funding explanation, but another effort to redefine the discussion. Shapiro moved forward before she could bury that failure beneath a longer defense, maintaining a pace that denied her the space needed to rebuild control. Each question became a beat, each non-answer became evidence, and the gaps between them grew increasingly uncomfortable. He then turned to her 2019 statement that the world would end in 12 years if climate change was not addressed, a declaration that had been repeated across speeches, interviews, social media posts, and fundraising communications. 7 years had passed, so Shapiro asked whether America was now 5 years away from the end of the world. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez described the statement as a rhetorical device, which immediately created the contradiction he had been waiting to expose. If the statement was rhetorical rather than literal, then it had been false when she used it to justify an enormously expensive policy program and to motivate supporters who were told that civilization was approaching a deadline. Shapiro argued that raising money through a claim a campaign knows is false moves the issue beyond political exaggeration and toward the legal language of material misrepresentation. That phrase changed the atmosphere because material misrepresentation was not another cable news insult designed to win applause from one side of the room. It was a term associated with campaign finance, compliance, donor communications, and the possibility that people had given money based on a claim that was presented as fact while privately understood as rhetoric. Shapiro was not a prosecutor or a member of Congress, but he was a Harvard-trained lawyer who understood that legal framing carries a different weight than partisan mockery. She had expected an ideological fight over climate change, but he was connecting her public statement to the way it had been used to solicit political support. The argument was no longer simply that she had exaggerated. It was that the exaggeration had been attached to fundraising, and fundraising records do not disappear when the applause ends. Shapiro moved next to her legislative record, asking how many of the 42 bills she had introduced during 7 years in Congress had actually become law. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but on live television, a few seconds can expose more than a 10-minute speech because the answer was zero. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had earned roughly $1.2 million in congressional salary during that period, built one of the largest political platforms in the country, and raised money by presenting each proposal as evidence that she was fighting the system. Yet none of those bills had crossed the line from political marketing into enacted law. Shapiro asked whether the product being sold to donors was legislative achievement or simply the appearance of permanent resistance. The question cut through the brand because it separated activity from accomplishment, headlines from outcomes, and fundraising language from the only result legislation is ultimately supposed to produce. Then came the issue of capitalism, where her rhetoric collided directly with the financial machinery sustaining her political career. Shapiro quoted her statement that capitalism was irredeemable and asked whether she still believed it. When she attempted to qualify the answer by criticizing the system in its current form, he returned to yes or no. A yes would mean she opposed the economic system used every day by the workers and business owners she claimed to represent. A no would mean she had repeated a belief she did not truly hold because the language was politically profitable. She searched for a third exit, but there was none, and Shapiro treated the refusal as confirmation before pointing to the capitalist transactions powering her campaign. Her operation had raised more than $15 million through Act Blue, sold $58 Tax the Rich sweatshirts, and relied on the same market structures she publicly described as beyond redemption. That contradiction became more damaging when Shapiro connected the fundraising message to the campaign's reported spending. Donors were being told that their $10 and $25 contributions were financing a fight against capitalism, while campaign records showed hundreds of thousands of dollars connected to private flights and tens of thousands spent on luxury hotels. The issue was not that political campaigns are forbidden from spending money, but that the image sold to small donors looked radically different from the lifestyle suggested by the expenditure reports. She had built her political identity around attacking wealth, privilege, corporate excess, and elite hypocrisy, yet her own campaign appeared to operate with the comfort and flexibility of the class she condemned. When the solicitation says revolution and the expenditure report says private jet, the contradiction does not require a complicated ideological argument because the numbers already make the accusation. Shapiro then introduced Danny Molina, a 28-year-old auto repair shop owner from East Elmhurst, Queens, inside her own congressional district. Danny earned roughly $47,000 a year, repaired cars, charged customers for his labor, paid his expenses, and used what remained to support his family, which made him a capitalist by the plainest possible definition. He had not studied economic theory, built a national political brand, or raised millions of dollars by denouncing the system in which he worked. He simply understood that providing a service in exchange for money was how he survived. She could call that arrangement irredeemable from a television studio while her campaign processed millions through private financial platforms, but Danny called it an ordinary workday because ordinary people do not have the luxury of condemning the mechanism that keeps their lights on. More importantly, Danny filed his tax returns every year, accounted for his income, reported his expenses, and accepted that even a small discrepancy could invite scrutiny, which allowed Shapiro to ask whether the Congresswoman's campaign records deserve the same standard. The comparison was devastating precisely because it was not abstract, ideological, or buried beneath economic terminology that viewers could dismiss as partisan noise. Danny ran a two-bay repair shop and knew what entered his business, what left it, what each job cost, and what every dollar represented, while she controlled a congressional office and a campaign operation worth millions yet repeatedly treated basic numerical questions as hostile traps. The contrast placed a working constituent beside the politician who claimed to speak for workers and revealed that the constituent appeared to understand accountability far better than his representative. She could produce a speech about systems, justice, oppression, and dignity without hesitation. But when the discussion reached costs, expenditures, legislative outcomes, or campaign claims, the certainty dissolved into qualifications. Shapiro did not need to accuse her of hypocrisy directly because the comparison between Danny's books and her rhetoric had already done the work. The next chain concerned crime, and this was where the debate stopped exposing ideological inconsistency and began exposing the distance between her public messaging and conditions inside her own district. Shapiro returned to June 2020 and asked whether she had posted a message supporting the movement to defund the police. While she immediately attempted to replace the wording with a broader explanation about reallocating resources toward community-based programs, he did not accept the substitution because the post existed under her name on her account using the word defund, and the question was whether she stood behind the position she had publicly promoted. She rose from her chair because sitting required her to remain inside the exchange, while standing allowed her to transform an answer into a performance directed toward the entire room. She declared that she had always supported community safety and insisted that defund had represented a wider movement to reimagine public safety, but the explanation avoided the only issue Shapiro had placed before her. He then asked whether she knew that crime in her district had increased by 70% since 2019, and the absence of an answer immediately revealed that she did not know the number. That failure was more damaging than any ideological disagreement because a member of Congress who had publicly supported defunding the police did not know the crime trend affecting the people living under the consequences of that argument. Shapiro cited FBI uniform crime data and placed the statistic beside a February 2025 constituent newsletter in which her office had claimed that the community was safer because of investments she had championed. Her communication said safer, the crime data showed a 70% increase, and no amount of emotional reframing could make those two descriptions occupy the same reality. The contradiction was brutal because it did not depend on Ben Shapiro's opinion, political affiliation, or interpretation. It depended on the Congresswoman's own newsletter and a federal crime statistic pointing in opposite directions. Shapiro argued that this was not a routine dispute over which public safety policy worked best, because the newsletter had made a factual declaration to constituents and potential donors. People reading the message were told that conditions had improved, and political supporters could reasonably contribute money, believing that her policies had produced that improvement, yet the crime data suggested the opposite. He again applied the campaign finance frame, emphasizing that a false factual statement appearing inside donor-facing communication could not be waved away as movement language, rhetorical urgency, or a misunderstood slogan. The room became quiet because viewers had just watched him connect a social media post, a district newsletter, an FBI statistic, and a fundraising consequence without making a speculative leap between them. She had spent years thriving in debates where moral intensity could overpower factual precision, but here the records were closing around her faster than her speeches could push them away. She responded with the weapon that had protected her throughout her political career: volume, passion, personal authority, and the theatrical force of someone determined to turn scrutiny into persecution. She cited tens of millions of Americans without health insurance, hundreds of thousands experiencing homelessness, and demanded to know where Shapiro's plans and legislation were, attempting to put the interrogator on trial rather than answer the evidence already introduced. She reminded the audience that he was a podcaster, not a judge, had never been elected, had never written legislation, and had never knocked on doors as she had. Then she delivered the emotional center of her defense by insisting that he had no right to reduce her work to a series of yes or no questions. Her section of the gallery rose in applause, rewarding the intensity of the speech, even though not one of the disputed figures, filings, claims, or contradictions had been resolved. Shapiro waited several seconds and then dismantled the applause without attempting to match her volume. He agreed that he was not a member of Congress and had not written a law, but pointed out that she was a member of Congress and that none of the 42 bills introduced during her 7 years had become law. He accepted that he was a podcaster, then observed that the podcaster had just informed the lawmaker of the crime rate in her own district because the lawmaker did not know it. The humiliation did not come from a clever insult. It came from the simplicity of the comparison, because the elected official had attacked his lack of institutional authority moments after demonstrating her own lack of command over the information her office was supposed to understand. Her attempt to disqualify the questioner had only emphasized that someone without her staff, salary, title, or resources appeared better prepared to discuss her district and her record. He rejected the claim that yes or no questions reduced public service, arguing instead that they tested the minimum level of factual accountability required from anyone seeking power. Did she pass the laws she promised? Did she know the numbers inside her district? And did her newsletter describe the community as safer while federal data showed crime moving sharply in the opposite direction? Those were not rhetorical traps, ideological puzzles, or unfair simplifications. They were elementary questions about performance, knowledge, and truthfulness. She wanted the audience to believe that her work was too complex to fit inside a direct answer, but complexity was not the reason the answers were missing. The answers were missing because each one threatened the political image her speeches, social media operation, and fundraising machine had spent years constructing. Shapiro returned to Danny Molina because the small business owner represented the standard her defenders could not dismiss as partisan hostility. Danny knew his revenue to the penny. understood the cost of every repair, tracked rent and supplies, and accepted that the government could audit him if his records failed to match his claims. She earned a congressional salary of $174,000, controlled a campaign fund exceeding $15 million, and still could not state the estimated cost of her signature proposal or the crime rate affecting her own constituents. Danny would face penalties if his numbers contradicted his filings, while the Congresswoman could contradict federal data, receive a standing ovation, and immediately return to campaigning for re-election. That double standard was the argument, and once stated that plainly, it became impossible to hide behind ideology. When the moderator called for closing statements, Shapiro did not review every number or repeat every contradiction because the structure of the debate had already made the conclusion unavoidable. He returned to the word she had used for 8 years and explained that the audience now understood why she had called the debate request catcalling. The avoidance had never been about intimidation, entitlement, or cruelty. It had been about a format in which social media followers could not substitute for facts and applause could not transform a non-answer into evidence. Yes or no denied her the space where polished paragraphs usually protected weak records and direct questions exposed the difference between emotional certainty and measurable performance. The most viral member of Congress had finally entered a setting where the camera could record her expressions but could not rescue her from the numbers. Shapiro then moved beyond the personal defeat and focused on the federal records that had appeared throughout the confrontation. Her newsletter said the community was safer while FBI data showed crime had increased. Her fundraising communications repeated a 12-year climate deadline she later described as rhetorical. And her public image emphasized commercial travel while campaign reports showed substantial private flight spending. Each conflict represented a difference between what supporters had been told and what formal records appeared to show, giving the issue a significance far beyond one evening's television ratings. Shapiro acknowledged that he had no subpoena power, no committee jurisdiction, and no authority to open an investigation, but he no longer needed institutional power to make the discrepancies visible. Millions of people had watched the record being assembled in real time, and millions of witnesses are much harder for political institutions to ignore than one podcaster holding a microphone. Her closing statement lasted nearly 3 minutes and ran beyond the time she had been given, which was entirely predictable because time limits only matter when the answer itself can survive compression. She spoke about the Bronx, her mother, working families, and the courage required to stand when powerful people demand silence, delivering the kind of polished emotional appeal that had carried her through hostile interviews, committee confrontations, and campaign rallies for years. It was a strong AOC speech, carefully built to shift the audience away from spreadsheets, filing records, crime statistics, and legislative outcomes, and back toward identity, struggle, symbolism, and moral urgency. Under ordinary circumstances, the speech would have produced exactly the reaction she needed, because a personal story can make a crowd forget that a question was never answered. But after 90 minutes of direct questions, missing numbers, contradictory records, and evasions dressed as context, the performance sounded less like a rebuttal and more like the evidence Ben Shapiro had spent the entire evening describing. The applause arrived anyway, loud and immediate, because her supporters had not come to evaluate federal filings or compare newsletter language with crime statistics. They had come to reward the brand they already trusted. Yet applause and documentation are not equal forms of proof, no matter how aggressively modern politics tries to pretend otherwise. A standing ovation can create the appearance of victory inside a studio, but it cannot alter a campaign expenditure, change the number of enacted bills, reduce a reported crime increase, or turn a rhetorical deadline into a factual one. Shapiro had forced a separation between emotional approval and verifiable performance, and once that separation became visible, the crowd's reaction began to look like insulation rather than vindication. She won the sound in the room, but the records won the argument, because records do not stand, cheer, or forget. That distinction was what made the debate more dangerous than a typical partisan clash that disappears after one news cycle and is replaced by the next manufactured outrage. Ben Shapiro had no subpoena authority, no committee staff, no federal agency behind him, and no legal power to compel her to produce a single additional document. What he had done instead was construct an evidentiary record in public by placing her statements beside the filings, statistics, newsletters, and legislative outcomes they appeared to contradict. Every answer, refusal, qualification, and correction was now recorded, time-stamped, clipped, and permanently available to anyone willing to compare the spoken claim with the written record. Once that kind of record exists, it begins attracting the attention of institutions that do possess investigative authority, because public contradictions become much harder to dismiss when millions of viewers have already watched them unfold. Two clips dominated the reaction, but they spread through different audiences and caused different kinds of damage to her credibility. The first showed Shapiro asking the estimated cost of the Green New Deal, her refusing to provide a number, and Shapiro introducing the $93 trillion estimate while emphasizing the absence of a defined cost analysis or funding mechanism. That clip reached tens of millions of views because it required no ideological background, no specialized understanding of climate policy, and no loyalty to either political camp. Anyone who had ever proposed a budget, managed a project, approved an invoice, or sat through a business meeting understood the absurdity of demanding support for a massive undertaking while refusing to state its estimated price. The clip crossed party lines because it presented the failure not as progressive, conservative, socialist, or capitalist, but as professionally indefensible. The reaction was particularly brutal because viewers did not need Ben Shapiro to explain what they had seen. After the question ended, she had promoted the Green New Deal as a transformational national program, defended it as a moral necessity, raised money around its urgency, and used it as proof of her seriousness as a lawmaker. Yet when confronted with the most basic question attached to any proposal of that scale, she treated the request for a cost as though the cost itself were an unfair framing device. A Bronx community figure shared the clip with 4 words, "She did not know," and that stripped away every rhetorical layer her team had spent years constructing around the proposal. The problem was not that she disagreed with Shapiro's preferred number. The problem was that she offered no number of her own. The second major clip carried a more serious institutional consequence because it placed her February 2025 constituent newsletter beside federal crime data showing a 70% increase since 2019. Her office had told readers that the community was safer because of investments she had championed, while the data presented during the debate appeared to show conditions moving sharply in the opposite direction. This clip did not travel mainly through general political entertainment accounts, where outrage rises quickly and disappears even faster. It circulated through campaign compliance circles, watchdog networks, election law discussions, and the community of professionals responsible for reviewing donor communications and expenditure disclosures. Their concern was not whether she had offered an optimistic interpretation. It was whether a donor-facing communication contained a material factual discrepancy. That phrase mattered because compliance professionals do not use the language of viral politics when evaluating campaign records. They look for statements that may have influenced donors, compare those statements with available data, and determine whether the difference is merely rhetorical or substantial enough to justify further review. Her newsletter had not simply promised that a future policy might make the community safer. It had stated that the community was already safer because of work her office had performed. If the FBI data cited during the debate accurately showed a dramatic increase in crime, then the communication was not merely exaggerated optimism, but a factual claim that appeared to conflict with the federal record. The debate had therefore transformed a political talking point into a compliance question by placing both documents in front of the same audience. During the first week after the debate, the National Legal and Policy Center filed a supplemental complaint with the Federal Election Commission, adding the newly recorded contradictions to an existing matter involving $18,725 in payments described as leadership training. The supplemental filing cited the debate footage and focused on 3 specific conflicts, rather than surrounding the complaint with broad partisan accusations that would make it easier to dismiss. It highlighted the public claim about commercial travel beside reported private flight expenditures, the Safer Community newsletter beside the crime figures, and the anti-capitalist fundraising message beside the campaign's own spending patterns. Each item was tied to a recorded statement, an identifiable document, and a specific point in the debate, creating a complaint built less on interpretation than on her own words. Shapiro had not filed the complaint, but his questioning had organized the evidence in a way that made the filing almost automatic. The earlier payments had already raised questions because psychiatric services were allegedly reported under the category of leadership training, a description broad enough to attract suspicion once the larger pattern became visible. Before the debate, defenders could isolate that expenditure, describe it as an administrative classification issue, and argue that critics were stretching a minor filing dispute into a scandal. After the debate, the payment no longer stood alone because viewers had now seen multiple examples in which the label attached to a claim appeared inconsistent with the underlying reality. Leadership training described psychiatric care, commercial travel appeared beside private jet expenditures, and a safer community appeared beside a 70% increase in crime. A single discrepancy can be dismissed as sloppy reporting, but repeated discrepancies begin to resemble a method. The Federal Election Commission also received approximately 2,300 individual complaints during the same week, an extraordinary volume directed at one member's filing record in such a compressed period. Many of those complaints were undoubtedly repetitive, politically motivated, procedurally weak, or unsupported by evidence beyond the viral clips, but volume still creates administrative pressure because ignoring thousands of submissions requires a decision just as surely as opening a review does. The complaints demonstrated that the debate had escaped the television studio and entered the formal machinery that campaigns are expected to respect. Her defenders could attack Ben Shapiro, mock his audience, dismiss the event as partisan theater, or celebrate her closing speech, but none of those reactions could delete the complaints already submitted. The most damaging consequence of the debate was not that she had lost an argument, it was that the argument had generated paperwork. By the second week, the House Office of Congressional Conduct received a referral from a nonpartisan accountability organization requesting a preliminary examination of her communications with constituents and donors. The referral did not accuse her of a crime, declare that misconduct had been proven, or pretend that a debate clip was equivalent to a final investigative finding. It asked whether the Safer Community statement and the other documented discrepancies warranted a closer review under the standards applied to congressional communications. That distinction made the referral harder to dismiss because it was framed as a request for verification rather than a partisan demand for punishment. A question backed by a federal statistic, a written newsletter, a public debate, and millions of viewers is not proof by itself, but it is more than enough to open a file, and once a file opens, every related record becomes relevant. By the third week, the political argument had moved beyond television panels, partisan commentators, and carefully edited social media clips because the consequences were now being measured inside her own district. Danny Molina was interviewed by a local Queens cable station inside his repair shop, standing beside the lifts, tools, invoices, and grease-stained equipment that represented the kind of work politicians praise during campaigns and forget once the cameras leave. He did not speak like a campaign consultant, a legal scholar, or an ideological activist, and that was precisely why his reaction carried more force than another polished attack from Washington. Danny explained that he knew the price of a brake job, the cost of a timing belt, the amount of his rent, and the value of every hour his employees spent on a vehicle. Then he asked the question that had already humiliated the Congresswoman on national television. How could someone promote a massive legislative proposal without knowing what it cost? The clip spread because Danny did not sound angry for the sake of being angry, and he did not appear interested in joining Ben Shapiro's audience or becoming a conservative celebrity. He sounded like a business owner who understood that mistakes involving numbers have consequences for ordinary people, while political figures often escape those consequences by turning every error into a debate about values. She had called capitalism irredeemable, but Danny fixed cars, charged customers, paid suppliers, covered payroll, and supported his family through the exact system she condemned. She raised millions of dollars using private platforms, sold campaign merchandise for profit, and spent heavily while telling working people that their economic system was morally broken. Danny's criticism therefore landed not as a partisan attack, but as a direct objection from one of the people whose labor had been reduced to a slogan. He stated that he had voted for her in 2020, but no longer believed he would support her again, and that single admission did more damage than 100 hostile endorsements from national Republicans. A loyal opponent can be dismissed as predictable, but a former supporter represents movement, and movement is what campaigns fear because it reveals that persuasion has already occurred. Danny had not changed his view because Ben Shapiro spoke faster, used sharper language, or embarrassed a politician on television. He changed his view because the debate showed him that the woman representing his district did not know the basic figures attached to the policies she had made central to her public identity. For a politician built on the promise of authentic representation, losing the confidence of a small business owner from her own district was not a minor image problem. It was a warning that the brand had begun separating from the people it claimed to embody. The interview accumulated millions of views, but its influence was not limited to the number displayed below the video. Other small business owners recognized themselves in Danny's frustration because they were required to track income, expenses, taxes, licenses, payroll, insurance, inventory, and every other financial detail that determines whether their businesses survive. They understood that a $200 discrepancy could lead to penalties, questions, or an audit, while a multi-million-dollar political campaign could describe expenditures with vague language and expect the public to accept the explanation. They also understood the insult buried inside her anti-capitalist rhetoric, because the people being condemned were not only billionaires, hedge funds, or multinational corporations. They were mechanics, restaurant owners, salon operators, shopkeepers, cleaners, drivers, and family businesses whose ordinary transactions had been declared morally irredeemable by someone whose campaign depended on those same transactions. A coalition of 47 small business owners from across New York organized a joint letter requesting a public accounting of the Congresswoman's campaign expenditures. The signatories represented auto shops, nail salons, bodegas, laundromats, restaurants, and other businesses that survived through small margins, long hours, and relentless attention to details that political rhetoric usually ignores. Their letter did not attempt to imitate the language of federal prosecutors, campaign finance attorneys, or congressional ethics investigators. It stated the problem in the language of people who file forms, keep receipts, and understand that every dollar must be explained. They were required to account for their money. They were punished for discrepancies. And they wanted to know why a representative who controlled more than $15 million should be judged by a lower standard. That letter was not a subpoena, a formal charge, or a legal ruling, but it carried a political danger that institutional complaints often lack. It gave regulatory action a form of public permission by showing that the demand for scrutiny did not come only from ideological enemies, national watchdogs, or media figures seeking another viral confrontation. It came from workers and owners inside the economic class she repeatedly claimed to defend, including people who paid taxes that funded her salary and lived with the consequences of policies she promoted. The 47 signatures transformed the issue from a personal battle between Shapiro and AOC into a question of equal treatment under the standards ordinary citizens face every day. Once constituents begin asking why their books are examined more carefully than their representatives' campaign filings, every official explanation sounds weaker. The debate had therefore created something far more dangerous than an embarrassing clip or a temporary decline in favorable coverage. It had created a pattern that connected her public language, fundraising appeals, expenditure reports, district communications, and legislative results. The Green New Deal was promoted as an urgent national necessity, but she could not state its estimated price. The 12-year climate deadline had been used as a warning and fundraising device, but she later described it as rhetorical. Her campaign identity attacked capitalism while relying on capitalist platforms, merchandise sales, luxury hotels, and private travel to sustain itself. Her newsletter claimed that the community was safer, while the crime statistic presented during the debate showed a 70% increase. Her public image emphasized ordinary travel and working-class solidarity, while campaign records allegedly reflected hundreds of thousands of dollars in private flight expenditures. Her record was presented as evidence of relentless legislative fighting, while 42 introduced bills had produced 0 enacted laws. Any one of those contradictions could have been dismissed as incomplete context, administrative error, political exaggeration, or the normal messiness of a large campaign. Placed together, however, they produced the appearance of a political operation that repeatedly described reality in whatever language best protected the brand. That appearance was exactly what Ben Shapiro had built during the debate. Without subpoena power, government staff, or the authority to compel a single answer, he did not need her to confess to wrongdoing, agree with his conclusions, or admit that her public claims conflicted with formal records. He needed only to ask questions precise enough that her refusal to answer became visible, and to place the available documents beside the rhetoric she used to escape them. The result was an evidentiary chain that viewers could follow without trusting Shapiro personally, because the claims, statistics, newsletters, and filings existed independently of his commentary. Once the chain was visible, the audience no longer had to choose which personality it liked more. It could compare the words with the record. For 8 years, she had called the proposed debate catcalling a label designed to transform an intellectual challenge into an act of male entitlement and to make refusal look principled rather than evasive. The accusation worked because it shifted attention away from the questions and toward the supposed impropriety of asking them. It allowed her supporters to treat every renewed invitation as harassment and every refusal as an act of resistance, even though the issues involve public policy, campaign, fundraising, legislation, and the use of taxpayer-funded authority. But after the debate, the label no longer protected her, because millions of people had finally seen what the invitation contained. It contained questions about cost, outcomes, crime, expenditures, fundraising claims, and the difference between what she told the public and what the records appeared to show. The confrontation was never truly about whether Ben Shapiro was polite, likable, elected, or entitled to her personal time. It was about whether a public official who built a national career around certainty could answer basic questions about the policies, district conditions, and financial operations attached to that career. Shapiro asked yes or no because yes or no prevents a politician from hiding inside a speech long enough for the audience to forget the original question. A direct answer creates a path to the next fact, while an evasive answer reveals that the path itself is dangerous. She had spent 8 years avoiding that structure because the structure did not reward the skills that made her famous. Her strength had always been the ability to turn complexity into moral clarity, conflict into a viral moment, and criticism into proof that powerful forces feared her. But yes or no questions reversed that advantage by turning moral certainty into a test of factual control. And the test revealed a congresswoman who knew how to command a room, but not how to account for the claims supporting her political operation. She still received applause. Her followers still defended her. And her closing speech still produced the emotional response her team expected. None of that answered how much the Green New Deal cost, how many of her bills became law, why the newsletter said safer, or why the reported expenditures appeared so different from the campaign image. The applause confirmed loyalty, but the unanswered questions confirmed the weakness beneath it. By the end, the word catcalling had collapsed under the weight of the record she had spent years avoiding. The invitation was not a demand for personal attention, and the questions were not an attempt to reduce her humanity, silence her voice, or deny the complexity of public service. They were the minimum questions any representative should be capable of answering after 7 years in office, more than $1 million in salary, tens of millions raised, and a national platform built on claims of competence and accountability. She had called the debate harassment because harassment can be rejected without explanation, while a legitimate question creates an obligation to respond. After 8 years, she finally sat across from Ben Shapiro.